This is part 2. This is where we got to. We have a sample of returns for Bank of America, a sample of returns for the S&P, and what we want to do now is just compare the two. And what we're going to do is something which is equivalent to the capital asset pricing model. It's a slightly simpler version of that because we're going to leave out the risk-free rate. We could add in the risk-free rate. We could add that to all these returns here, or rather subtract it from these returns to get the return over the risk-free rate for the market and the return over the risk-free rate for Bank of America. So it's just be the difference between the two. The risk-free rate is a little bit complex because what do we take, the average for all these 12 years, or do we change it each month? And the risk-free rate currently is very, very low. Probably in developed countries it's close to 0%. So just to remove that complication, I'm going to leave this out. What I want to do is really compare these two returns. And so what I'm going to do is first of all just set up a scattergram, and a scattergram will visually compare the returns on these two instruments. And there's many ways to set up the scattergram. I think the easiest probably is to insert and then ask for a scattergram, and the simple one is going to look like this. Now, we haven't actually told Excel which figures to use, and it's quite important to make sure that we choose the right ones in the right order. So what we want to end up with is something along the lines of y equals a plus bx is the equation we're trying to get, and y is going to be this vertical axis and x is the horizontal axis, and essentially we want to understand more about the return of Bank of America by looking at its relationship with the market. So x is going to be the return on the market, and y is going to be the return on Bank of America. So if we right click on this graph, it lets us select the data. So this lets us choose which data we're going to use, and we're going to remove this which we've already got. We're going to add in our scattergram. So remember I said the x variable has got to be the return on the market. So we put in the return on the market E2 to E154, and then our y values have got to be the return of Bank of America. So C2 to C154, make sure they're exactly the same, and we compare each figure with its equivalent. We've got the data here. If I can find where my graph was, there it is. So here's our relationship between the two. We've got along the horizontal axis return on S&P, vertical axis return on Bank of America, and we can see that there's this positive relationship. Not surprisingly, when there's a change in the overall market, the S&P 500, there seems to be a change in Bank of America. And what we want to do now is try to estimate the relationship between the two. So we like to draw a line which will best represent that information. So there's two ways of doing this. The first way is the simplest way, is to right click on this and to add a trend line. And the trend line is just going to be a linear trend line which will estimate a regression or an ordinary least squares, which will minimize the gap between each of these blue dots and the line that we draw. And Excel will do that for us. We don't have to worry about it. And what I want to do also is display the equation on the chart. So remember I said it's going to be y equals something x. This is what the actual relationship is. Remember, y is Bank of America return, x is the return on the market, and so you can see the return on Bank of America equals 1.5632 times by x. What that tells us is that when x goes up by 1%, when there's a 1% gain in the S&P 500, Bank of America goes up on average by 1.56%. And when the market goes down by 1%, Bank of America goes down by 1.56% on average. Obviously, it doesn't happen all the time because the blue dots are not on this black line. But on average, that's what happens. That 1.58 is essentially the beta. It's slightly different calculation. It's a slightly simpler calculation, but as long as we're using the same calculation for our analysis of different securities, this will give us a good idea again of the relationship between the return on Bank of America and the return on the market. And also it tells us something about risk. It tells us that this stock is more volatile than the overall market, that when the market does things, Bank of America does a lot more. And so any beta above 1 tends to be a risky stock. Any beta below 1 would say that when the market moves, this stock moves a little bit less, and so that's something which is a bit safer.